there's so many events and so many brilliant discussions, and I know there's quite a lot going on in other tents, but so thank you for being with us. I'm Professor Mary Brennan from the University of Edinburgh Business School. I'm also chair of the Scottish Food Coalition, principal investigator on a Wellcome Trust funded project that is going to be creating a living Good Food Nation lab here in Scotland. And Ninian has asked me to chair the session today, where we're going to be thinking a little bit more about turning policies into practice. And we've got perspectives coming from science, from policy, policy regulation, and from the ground, from the farming community. So that what I wanted to do was give the panel members a few minutes just to introduce themselves and set their background in context so that you understand where they're coming from. I have then got four fairly tricky questions for them. They have seen them in advance. And hopefully we will get through those questions. I'm going to pause after the second question and we'll open it up for questions and then come back for the third and fourth question. So that's certainly the plan. We'll see how we go. So thank you very much. So I'll hand over to Heather first, Heather Kelman, who's the chair of Food Standards Scotland.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Mary's just said, I'm Heather Kelman. I've been chair of Food Standards Scotland for 2 years, and before that I was a member of Food Standards Scotland Board since it was formed in 2015, so 9 years in total. Before that, as a young girl, I grew up with a grandfather who was a baker and uncles and aunts who were farmers or shepherds across the islands and the northeast of Scotland. So food is my passion, and probably not surprisingly, I went into dietetics as my first job and did that for 10 years before going into management and planning within the NHS with a real focus on health improvement, health inequalities, and how to address inequality in society. So being a chair of Food Standards Scotland is like all my dreams come true. I feel really privileged to have the job. I get to meet with lots of wonderful people across Scotland, and I suppose that's what really strikes me about policy in this relation of food. For me, policy is about finding solutions, an agreed solution to a problem or an emerging issue. So for one of the ones that's probably really quite current is looking for answers to precision breeding. How should we regulate that? How should we manage the precision breeding? Most of that's happening in England at the moment, but in Scotland we have to be aware of it because the Internal Market Act means that anything that happens in England can be sold in Scotland. So we have to be a bit aware of what's going on in UK as well as Scotland. But policy for me is just about getting the right inputs, the right evidence, seeing if that will build up to a solution to whichever challenge is in front of you, and then taking that through legislation. FSS are responsible for developing policy in food and feed safety, composition and standards for food as well. So we actually develop policy in those areas, and we advise Scottish Government on nutrition and health policy.
Excellent. And over to Wendy Russell.
Thank you. So hi everyone, and I see a few folk in the audience who were in my last talk, so apologies, but my introduction is going to be very much the same. So I'm Wendy Russell, I'm from the Rowett Institute, so we're part of the University of Aberdeen's medical school. I work very much in the nutrition and health arena, but I also lead the microbiome, food innovation and food security work at the University of Aberdeen. In addition to that, I lead the Sustainable Food Security and Supply programme for the Scottish Government Strategic Research Programme. So that's very much working close with policy teams. And I know Heather very well and a lot of other policy people, so we're very engaged with policy. On the research side, my own research is about prevention of non-communicable diseases, things like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. But I'm very interested in changing the food environment in order to make that easy for people to change their diet. I don't think the environment we live in at the moment is very conducive to making the right food choices. So I think we need to change the environment that people actually live in and help them to do those things. So my own research is around changing the types of crops that we grow in the UK and particularly in Scotland, looking at novel crops that can be more healthy and how we manage our marginal lands. And policy to me is a very powerful tool. I think we really need to use it as a powerful tool. I think it needs to be evidence-based. I'm coming from a research background, and I think evidence-based policy is a real strength, and I really enjoy working with policy teams in the Scottish Government.
Excellent, thank you very much. And Over to you, William.
I'm William Houstoun. I grew up on our family's farms in Glenisla and Glenshee. My brother and his son now run Glenkilry and Glenshee, and I graze some of their sheep through the summer. I've also worked outside the farm. Started off managing ranches on 1 million acres in Venezuela, and my last sort of full-time job was managing Angus growers, an 18-member soft fruit co-op based in Arbroath, selling 50 million pounds a year of soft fruit into the supermarkets. If anyone says that co-ops don't work in Scotland, I think that shows that they do. I've also worked as a consultant in food and farming, including researching and writing a paper on public sector food procurement for Government Office North West. So I've taken, that was looking for local food into the public sector 20 years ago, so I had an interest in the area since then. I discovered holistic management too late in life, 20 odd years ago, and trained first on Lismore and then the States and Zimbabwe with Alan Savory. And in the Savory Institute, not me personally, but I'm in touch with people working with a number of governments worldwide on developing policy holistically. I'm now one of the founding farmers of the European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, about 70 of us, all hands-on farmers from all over Europe. We're a lobbying organisation working initially to promote the need for genuinely regenerating agriculture to the EU Commission, and really standing up for nature and what farming in tune with nature can do, and standing up against the lobbying from the multinationals who have the government and civil servants' ears. We started in November last year. Since then, we've spoken at COP in Dubai, the World Economic Forum in Davos, and one of our members also has his own personal seat on the FAO at the United Nations. We were asked by the EU to put together a white paper on policy for their CAP reform for 2027-2031. I don't think there's anyone from the Scottish Government that will be, but just to put things in perspective, we put a white paper on policy together in 6 weeks. An organisation that had only been going for a month at the time, fully researched, available on the EARA website if anyone's interested. We're currently running a pilot project using satellite mapping of photosynthetic activity as a basis for the single farm payment, to take all the bureaucracy, checks, and everything else out of it. To me, and this is a quote from an MSP in the Scottish Parliament at a round table I was at. He said, policy is not working for farmers, food, people, health, or nature. The only beneficiaries seem to be the agri-food companies. And putting my savoury hat on, the people in those companies are the same ones who are suffering from food policy. So, and this is a big issue in the whole policy thing, that people think differently as individuals from when they're representing an institution. And we really want to try to get people able to speak as people at policy level. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Just in the context, so we're obviously in an environment as described by the Cabinet Secretary yesterday, where we have the new Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill and the Good Food Nation Act. And I suppose what we're really looking to explore through the questions and discussions today is how will the relationship between producers, researchers, customers, policymakers, corporations determine success or failure, and success and failure within that. So to start off with, I wanted to ask a question that sort of delves into evidence-based policy making. So for each of the panel, I'll go through you in turn. What are your experiences of this approach to evidence-based policy making, and I suppose some of your reflections on how that has evolved over the last, I suppose, couple of decades, really, in the context of agriculture and food policy in Scotland? Would you like to start, Heather?
Yeah, I think my experience is largely on the food side, because obviously Scottish Government's responsible for agriculture, but that doesn't mean we stand separate to that and do quite a lot of work with Scottish Government. For me, the evidence should come first. you identify an issue. If we don't have evidence to understand that issue correctly or find the solutions for that correctly, we've got to commission the evidence, the evidence-based research. It's absolutely essential. It's the only way that we can ever get policy that everybody will agree is suitable to go through, is to go back to that basis of evidence that lets you speak truth when people maybe don't want to hear the truth. So if you've got science and evidence behind you, it helps you say things that some people maybe don't want to hear. If I give you an example of one of the areas that we've recently been involved in influencing agriculture policy, it was in relation to the recommendations from the Climate Change Committee on the reduction of meat and dairy consumption by various percentages over the next 10, 15 years. And we were asked to comment on that from the point of view of public health nutrition. And for us, the first thing was to go and look at the evidence base and check what did that mean, what did we know in terms of consumption of meat and dairy, people's health, the impact of reduction on that. And we discovered we had quite a bit of gap in knowledge in that. So we commissioned some research from University of Edinburgh, which they did very quickly and very well, and it's really helpful. And actually we went back and said to Scottish Government, there's a couple of reasons that really we wouldn't be recommending a change to the guidelines. One, we're not achieving the guidelines anyway that we've got, so it'd be good to actually focus on achieving the evidence-based guidelines on diet and health that we've got. But the second thing was we discovered quite a level of low health in Scotland, nutritional health in Scotland. And actually meat and dairy were two of the foods that if you removed them from the diet, we would have worsened the position quite a bit. So we have said that there's more work to be done in this, and that really we think that the current guidelines are absolutely fit for policy. And I think that piece of work has been recognised not just in Scotland as being very valuable, but across the UK. So for me, evidence and policy go strongly together. It is really easy for people to divert you from the outcome that you're trying to seek, whether that's vested interest groups or people with a one-sided perspective. And what I've learned over the years, food is definitely not a two-dimensional issue. You've got to look at it from all 360 degrees. You need a 3D structure before you can decide which way to go. Looking at it from one perspective or another, just looking at it from climate change does not help really with the underlying issue that we produce food to have a healthy public. And we've got to get much better at meeting that needs for health with just the right amount of the right food in the right quantities at the right time. And if there's waste to come out, if there's surplus emissions to come out, for me it's to come out in the foods that do us harm. The foods that are not contributing to our micronutrients or our well-being. So that's my feeling on that, Mary.
And just picking up on one aspect that you're talking about there, so you're saying sort of the evidence, and I do agree, the evidence is really important, but of course there isn't just one evidence. So what is your experience and your sort of sense of how the diversity of evidence and how we cope with maybe conflicting or evidence that is in tension with each other, and if you have some examples, that would be really great.
I think possibly one of the ones that we could go back to is the folic acid fortification of flour. I mean, really, we started off by reviewing the literature on that. We were asked to look into whether folic acid was a good or a bad idea to fortify flour in the country. And so we started off with a literature review. What was not just happening locally in Scotland or the UK, but worldwide. We looked at what was happening elsewhere. We pulled all the evidence together. We went out to consult. We didn't just look at it from the point of view of the nutritional benefits and the prevention of fairly life-limiting conditions in babies. We actually looked at it from the point of view of the cost for manufacturers, the cost of conversion, other ways that you could get it, whether or not there was any sectors of the population that would be at risk from fortification. We knew there was benefits for young mothers, but we needed to know if there was any sectors of the population that would be at risk. So there was a wide consultation. We did a literature review. We did all of that. And then right at the end, to make sure our science was fit for purpose, we took that to NICE, the Committee of Evidence on Food, and just got them to review that our science was correct and that we were pulling out the correct assumptions. actually, our research said that the evidence was there that folic acid fortification was a really good thing. That was not just from written evidence, it was from experience in other countries. But what we also found was it was not cost effective for Scotland to do that on its own, that we needed the other 3 nations in the UK because flour flows across borders, back and forth in all sorts of forms. So it had to be a UK-wide thing. So then we had to take our evidence down and convince the UK government that they needed to join in this. So it's been a long process, but we've been confident all the way through that we were doing the right thing for the right reasons with the best evidence we could assimilate.
Brilliant. That's a really great example. So Wendy, from your perspective, and you operate, but you have your own sort of disciplinary specialism, but also you work in very interdisciplinary environments. So from your perspective.
Yeah, so as a researcher, we are about creating the evidence, obviously, to support policies that are being made in Scotland. Heather said a lot of what I was going to say. I was actually going to use the folic acid as an example. Many of my colleagues were involved in that folic acid fortification and creating that evidence. So I'll use some sort of more recent examples of where we're trying to develop new policies. So I guess one area is in mycotoxins. So, mycotoxins are measured routinely in crops, and a lot of legislation is associated with that. Our researchers are looking at mass mycotoxins, really understanding the metabolism and change. And, the policies will change based on that research, and it is so important that research is evidence-based because you could so easily create policy that really isn't meaningful. And another area, I suppose, that we've been involved in is I'm very keen to get hemp into production in Scotland. I know a lot of you have probably heard me talking a lot about hemp, but hemp is something that can really contribute to reducing emissions in Scotland, but we're hampered by legislation. The farmers are finding it really difficult to grow due to licensing, so we've continually worked with policymakers to fight the legislation down at DEFRA and have that legislation changed. And thankfully it was loosened in April. We'll still fight to get it removed, but it's been loosened. So those are some examples of where we are currently working. But I think what we need is a step change in the way our food and agriculture system is working. We just can't continue to nudge. We need big changes. And we only ever saw big changes in the past, really at times of war, where policy and research work together to make those big changes. And if we're going to get the change that's needed to meet what's required for our future agri-food system, we're going to need that kind of incentive again. And I think research and policy working together is our only option, really, of delivering that.
And just picking up on one aspect you said right at the very beginning, you said we undertake research we create research to deliver policy.
We create the evidence
to support policy.
Yeah.
Is it a chicken and egg situation, so to speak, in terms of do you feel you're being driven to create evidence for policy ideas that already exist, or to help to inspire and transform the ways in which we might think about policy?
Yeah, so that's a really good question because, obviously the research we do is commissioned through the Scottish Government, so, it could come from policy. I think we have to also, as scientists, create the incentive for the research to be done because we are the experts. We know a lot of what is required. So I think it has to happen both ways. I think we need, but in a very positive note, I've worked on Scottish Government-funded research for decades, and only now do I feel that we have a really close relationship with policy. I think we're working better together more than ever. And I think, in Scotland, we've got a real opportunity here to get it right.
And what has driven that change? Or is it just time and patience?
Do you know what? I always think, if you're in the last session, change for me is always driven by motivation, and motivation is driven by fear and longing. And I think when you see a food system that's wrong, everybody really is motivated to change it. And I think that motivation has cut across policy and research and many of the stakeholders. And I think that's where we're seeing a change and people really trying to drive that change.
Yeah. So William, drawing on your breadth of experience, both as a farmer, a business owner, or a cooperative manager, but also on that international scale, how are you seeing the relationship between evidence and policy making?
One of my mantras is believe what you see, don't see what you believe. And I think we really have to learn to forget what we've been told and learn to look for ourselves and really work out what we're seeing. Because I'm just going to bounce about. Alex Brewster this morning was saying farming went wrong in about 1890 and started down a route which included the Haber-Bosch process for producing nitrogen for explosives, which was then used for fertilizers, and making big machinery for tanks, which then turns into farm machinery. And that is what policy has been based on, that sort of background. And we're now beginning to see that if we manage nature well, nature will produce food without a lot of those inputs. If we give nature the conditions to produce food, it'll happen. If we can see and understand what's happening. And so, and as I think others have said, it's time for a step change, but we have to be careful and do it on evidence. But it has to be real knowledge, not bullshit given to us by lobbying people. And we're lucky in Scotland with the quality of research we've got. And we're a small country, so we can work together. So yes, I think we really have to be regenerating both our land, our soil, which is at the basis of it, but also our knowledge and how we work with each other. And the regenerative community, as other people have said, is remarkable at this time because we're so open with our mistakes. We are quite as happy to share our mistakes with our peers as our successes, because we would hate to see a friend make the same mistake we made last year and suffer because of it.
Certainly from that session this morning, which I thought was phenomenal, was the word that came to my mind was observation.
Yes.
And being observant and being curious.
Yep.
And that seems to be at the heart of what being a regenerative farmer, or one of the skills you really need. And I think it is but also the point you make there about the evidence from the field, from those who are working the land, and actually us appreciating different types of knowledge and different types of evidence is really important. And I think there's still work to do in that, I think, from an academic perspective and from a policy to really appreciate lived experience and the different types of knowledge and tacit understanding that you have.
Yeah, but yes, and I think the real progress is being made on the farm, but we will then need the academics to come and take that step forward and explain it. As
Denise Walton was talking about in terms of the quality of her beef and the nutritional, the high omega-3. Yes, absolutely. But it's that partnership type. Moving on, we know we've talked about this pivotal moment and that possibly, and you're going back to 1890 and all of those decisions that were made, not necessarily for or because of agriculture and food, but which influenced. We think we're in a sort of once in a multi-generational sort of opportunity as we transform how we support farming to assure it aligns and works with the ambitions of the Good Food Nation. So based on your experiences, how should we use this unique policy window to drive greater alignment between agriculture and food policy? I'm going to go to Wendy first on that one.
Okay, so I guess for me the link between the Agricultural Bill and the Good Food Nation Bill is really shifting primary production. I think we've got a real opportunity to change our primary production system and how we use that. I think not just primary production, but making sure that there's sector alignment. I think if we can get sector alignment, then we can make that primary production and food processing sector work together, and we can really deliver. And we see that as a really important model there. I'm really excited at this opportunity that we have. I think we are in a pivotal moment, and I think in Scotland we are exactly the right size of nation, and we all know each other. We work together, and there's a huge opportunity for us to deliver change. I'm really excited by it.
William.
Yes, I mean, I was pleased yesterday to hear Marie Gouchon say that there's a food group within the Scottish Government who work. My disappointment is that the policy isn't made holistically to start with. And the way we work in Savoury is the first thing we do is identify how we would like life, our business, our country to be, and then judge everything. Is it taking us nearer to that ideal or taking us further away? So we're always heading there.
And how then, in that context, do you juggle competing interests or the trade-offs that might have to be managed? How you support individuals or organisations moving from one mode of operation to another? So how do you battle through those?
We have a framework, a crib sheet basically, of the order to take things through, of how we want it to be. And then you work, I always start from the financial side because it's with a business, but you can then check that it fits the financial ambitions, it fits the biology, it's sustainable, it's not making a decision which will have an unintended consequence. And once you get into the way of this framework, you just think that way and you manage the complexity, because every biological system is complex. And if a car breaks down, has a puncture, you put a new tire on, you've got the same car. But if you take one species out of an ecosystem for a year, that whole ecosystem changes. And so you then have to be aware of this change and manage. And it's like introducing apex predators, or they won't have the expected consequences. They might have, the big one might be the same, but there'll be other unexpected and unintended ones. And we always have to be aware of these, or they'll catch us out.
Is there a danger, though, that we are so fearful of those unintended consequences that we struggle to make change, that we get caught in the sort of inertia of the status quo, that we just get caught in the current?
I think we've got to get over fear and be confident in our knowledge, and that we have systems that work, and confident in each other, so that if you don't know about something, but you know someone who does, you ask them, you trust them, and really build this trust in the community, so that we're working as an ecosystem which feeds off each other and helps each other.
Yeah. So Heather, from your perspective, and I suppose drawing both on your NHS career as well as your time with Food Standards Scotland, you have sat at tables where there's a lot of and in rooms and eaten canapes with many people with vested interests and different resources and different positions and different ideologies. What are you seeing as the opportunities, and how we can really harness this opportunity and take forward this generational sort of opportunity?
I always start by saying that this job is an absolute privilege, and I do get to meet people I never thought I would get the chance to sit in a room with. So I actually meet regularly with nearly all the major retailers. I meet regularly with the chief scientists and various departmental sciences across Scottish Government. I meet with the institutes and other academics. I get an opportunity to talk to third sector organisations, to National Farmers Union, to the Scottish Association meat wholesalers. So I work right across the food sector, and I feel that going in and actually having a few real world examples of why the way we've been doing food policy and food chains in the UK is not sustainable. So we've had Ukraine, which led us to an acute shortage of sunflower, which impacted on animal feed, impacted on the provision of oil for cooking, it impacted on the hospitality trade. We've had Brexit and the impact the EU exit has had on food leaving Europe to come across here. The delays at borders, which has meant that fruit and veg are not as fresh as they once were when they came across uninterrupted. Well, cost of living was a really another one, and obviously COVID. COVID was another one where we had shortages of food, and we had to find a way of making sure that everybody across society could get access to food. So there's a real food security issue. And I think that has become a real worldwide recognition that worldwide food chains are not the most secure way to secure food for your population. And sadly in Scotland, although we produce some of the best food in the world, a very small percentage of that is actually eaten in Scotland. So we need to get better at shortening those food chains, being a lot more sustainable within Scotland in terms of what we produce, how we produce it, making sure that we can actually stand on our own 2 feet if something was to happen. And so I think that realism, that burning bridge has come along at the same time as we've actually been building up towards this new agriculture bill and the Good Food Nation Act. And I think that that has given us methodologies by which we can engage parties that were perhaps not quite as engaged in the food production as food and health. I actually did say to the NFU a few weeks ago, you really need to get back to talking about farming as primary production of food, because the public don't automatically link farming with food. And we really need to promote that, because that is the strength of farming. It's the reason it exists. It is about ultimately feeding the population. So I think that connection is becoming stronger. And I think there's a will, a desire, a motivation, because there's this impacts coming at us around the world, geopolitical or climate change, that is really saying we've got to get more secure in our food supply locally. And, as Wendy and others have said, this is such a small nation of people that love to chat to each other. And so if you get people in a room, you can actually start to make the connections. The food system is complex, but it can be solved by creating connections between people in positions of authority. And yes, I do sit in dining rooms with the Food and Drink Federation. I've had the pleasure of speaking to several directors of Coca-Cola or Pepsi. And basically, I feel I've got a bit of moral high ground, and I can say the first thing of any business is to do no harm. That you have to actually be responsible, and the food you produce should be safe. And that's not just safe in a food standards type way, it's actually safe in terms of damaging people's health. And I don't feel the least bit apologetic about being able to say that. The evidence is so strong on the link between cancer and obesity, type 2 diabetes, and what we eat. Just a whole host of health diseases. And in Scotland, we're very passionate about the NHS, and we know it's really struggling for funding. So getting under some of these diet-related causes of ill health is one of the ways we can save the NHS, and the NHS being free at the point of access, by getting into this preventative mode, by making sure people have access to affordable, safe, healthy food. And we grow it, and we could grow more of it, and we could grow different types of it with the right support to innovate in terms of covered agricultural environment farming and that kind of thing. But we need to have the will and the commitment and the enthusiasm across all partners to make that change. And I suppose that's been my experience. I just sit there and drop vocal bombs and let people chat back to me, so it's fun.
And have you experienced through those vocal bombs a sort of shifting in the perspectives of these corporations, and a shifting in what they see as both their organisational as well as their moral and ethical imperative to address the true costs of the products that they sell?
It's small progress, but it is progress. So reformulation projects, the fact that all the big retailers have nutrition teams who are there to actually guide and support and advise the company on how they can make improvements of what they've said. Each retailer has a slightly different approach to that, but that's good because it means we're learning from that and sharing that best practice. Will we ever see the day that there's sort of like one line of Coca-Cola bottles rather than a whole aisle of Coca-Cola bottles or Pepsi bottles or whatever? I don't know. I think there's a range of things that might come about with that. But there's definitely an interest from them in changing the range of things that they put on the table. They're going to fight against, we've got the consultation on it's finished, but we've just finished consulting on promotion of high-fat, salt, sugar food, which is really most of the processed foods, and actually stopping the buy one, get one free and all of that kind of thing. Now, they're very anxious about that because that will hit straight at profits. But that doesn't mean they can't have promotional deals. They've just got to be on healthier products. So those kinds of policy can be used to move legislation forward a bit, move behaviour forward a bit within the retailers and the producers. I know that the work we've done through the Food and Drink Federation on Scottish bakeries, a lot of the bakeries have been really highly motivated with tiny little grants to reformulate their products to be healthier, and that's encouraging.
Brilliant. Right, so we'll just give the panel a little break, and I'll open it up for some questions on in those first two areas. So I see a hand going up straight away here in the middle. And we'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll go back.
Apologies if this turns into a rant.
Can
I
you
will not
stand?
use...
Can you?
Yeah.
I think they want you to stand up and say who you are.
Okay, Jamie Buchanan Jardine. I manage Castlemilk and Corrie Estates down by Lockerbie. I'll try not to rant or use pejorative language here. It seems to me that you're talking about healthy, high-quality food, and that's a synonym for British food, which comes from British farming. The best policy that you could do for British farming is to stop importing food from, whether it's boatloads of lamb from New Zealand or beef from America or veg from wherever else. Why is the government wasting so much energy on fluffy policy when one policy of limiting imports could do more for British farming than any of the others?
Right, I suppose
Do you want
that's
to start?
aimed
I'll give them all a chance. Will you start?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I think that's really interesting. And of course, those trade deals are actually negotiated out of UK government at Westminster, which we try and influence. The official way that we're allowed to look at those trade deals is through what they call a Section 42 report. And all that we're asked to do as Food Standard Scotland is to make sure that the deal complies with British food safety and food standard requirements, which of course they do at the offset, because it says in the deal that they must comply with our food safety and food standards. But deals like that are not made on the basis of food alone. Basically, it's a bit of hog trading between one country and another about getting exports and imports. Now, is that the right way to do things? How do we change that? There's obviously a demand from various industries in the UK to import those foods because somebody has to buy it. And I suppose that's where we're trying to work on in terms of looking at the quality of food and the range of foods that we produce in this country and trying to get a greater emphasis from our supermarkets or food manufacturers to look at local. And the Good Food Nation Act actually has a bit of work going on that, looking at the public bodies, so the NHS and the local authorities, and trying to get them to lead by example. So we will see, we are looking at ways of countering that. So do you introduce a policy that blocks trade, in which case you'll get a reciprocal deal coming from somewhere else in the world blocking our exports, which is, food's a huge export for Scotland. So that would be a risk. But if we actually become more sustainable and produce more that is accessible and affordable in this country, there'll be less need for them to import. And I think it's a complex environment, but I think that's the best that we can do at the moment, is we're keeping a watching eye on standards. It's not our job to comment on animal welfare, but we always mention it. We always mention pharmaceutical, although again, that's not in my remit, our remit is Food Standard Scotland, but we do make sure that if there's anything that we think there is a risk around pharmacy or animal welfare, that the right bodies are actually being brought to their attention, so they will comment on it.
Anyone else want to add?
Can I just add? I think we hear a lot about eating local and blocking imports, but our agricultural system in Scotland isn't fit for purpose to deliver our food at the moment. I mean, we have 6 million hectares in agricultural land. Only 10% of that is arable farming, and all we grow predominantly is barley. 60% of that barley goes to animal feed, and the rest goes to brewing and distilling. We eat about 2% of that barley crop. So at the moment, we're not producing the food to feed our nation. So we really have to change what we're producing at the moment if we want to work towards a food production system that could actually come from farming in Scotland.
Would you like to add anything?
Yes, I mean, taking everything that's been said, the public sector buys an incredible amount of food. And I think they should have to buy local food wherever they can. And to fit the current, and give them a 10-year timescale, that in 10 years' time, everything that can be local must be local. And I've run projects on this on a small scale. In Cockermouth schools, we had a thing. The purchasing policy was what the dinner lady could buy on her way to work down the high street. And it reinvented the local food policy there, because they had a school sausage that the butcher made, which encouraged all the parents to buy from the local butcher. And the shops knew that the dinner lady would be coming, so if they had something that was on just about to reach its end of life, the school got a special deal. And it just built the local policy because they knew they had the school contract every 5 days a week throughout the school term. And we've got to be innovative to find ways to use the public sector to encourage local food
Well, there's
producers.
interesting examples in and around different but similar. On Isla, I know Argyll and Bute are all of the beef served in Isla schools is coming from an Isla farmer, and also in Orkney, the famous chicken sausage roll that has become the biggest seller in the Orkney sort of butchers was developed purely for or specifically for Orkney schools. Any other questions? There's one right there at the back.
So I just want to pick up on this comment about we need to change what we're producing. So I've just been part of a team that's been doing some consultancy work on behalf of TSI Murray to find out if Murray could feed itself. And the answer is yes, it could, on 11% of the land, taking out 20% for urban. This was a huge surprise to us. But as you've just said, the range of crops that have been grown, including livestock, is about sort of 6 or 7 types. What we could be growing is about 82 different types of fruit and vegetables, as one of the consultants on the piece of work, Joe Hunt, actually grows up in the Black Isle. However, who are we selling to? Because if there's all of that food that is produced is actually taken up, as you said, by most of it by the distilleries, taken out of Murray, taken out of Scotland, and all of the value, which is enormous compared to the farm gate price, gets taken out of the country. At the same time, there's 95,000 people living in Murray, spending £250 million a year on food, mostly from the supermarket, some tourists, but not very much. All comes up from distribution centres outside of the region. So we're growing food and exporting it, and we're buying food and importing it into the region. So what is missing, the middle part of all of that, is the processing and all of the distribution networks as well, because there's no distribution hub in Murray. So if a local farmer wants to put their food into a supply chain, there isn't one to take it up. It has to go all the way down to, it's west of Edinburgh. So that's the problem, actually. That's the sticking point right there. And then my question is, how do we solve that? If the problem is processing and distribution networks, whose job is that to take the first step?
William, would you like to start with that? And it is going to follow into one of my next questions, but absolutely pick up on that.
It could be, I think part of the problem is everything is centralised. Other countries, it's much more localised. France have their chambre in each department, in each county, which can put funding, the sort of infrastructure funding into what's needed in that county. And here it all has to go through Edinburgh or London. It's partly communities. I was in New England and found they have community supermarkets there. This community has come together and bought a supermarket for their community. There are 35 of these. The 35 supermarkets now have a cooperative infrastructure which buys loo paper and sugar and things they don't produce. The truck that delivers those can pick up, if there's a cheesemaker in one community that makes too much, it'll take it to the next supermarket. And they've built within the communities their own infrastructure. It takes bravery, and these were university towns which started it, so they had the expertise to do it. But we kind of have to take back responsibility and stop expecting government to do everything for us. At the same time, I'm very aware, I'm hoping, Joe Hunt's one of the drivers behind this, that in the new Agriculture Act, funding will be available for very small commercial operations rather than the 3 hectare or whatever it is at the moment. In the EARA white paper, we're giving small places 10 times the hectareage payment of a larger place to encourage small local food. Final thing, Kirriemuir, I have to give them a shout. They've had a 2-acre community garden for the last 10 years. They've just signed a deal with Kinnordy Estate next door for a 17-acre community garden to grow food for the community, sell it through the zero waste shop in town, any excess goes into the food bank for free. So it's a community taking responsibility for its own food to grow its food. And I think we have to shame government into showing that communities can do this for ourselves. Not everyone can do it. You've got the model from us, so help other communities that don't have the good citizens that are prepared to do this, to do it in other places, and just replicate this model we've shown that can work. You know, there's lots of ways, but it takes the movers and shakers.
Any other small points from on infrastructure and networks and
abattoirs? One word.
Yes, abattoirs.
I thought.
Yeah, I mean, abattoirs are a really tricky problem because at the moment, the way that the regulations are, you've got to have a vet whenever there's a culling going on. And of course, we've got a national shortage of vets across the UK at the moment. We're not taking that lightly. Our chief exec was out in Canada last week talking to the big shakers in the World Trade Organization about changing when you need a vet. So we're actually trying to drive through some work that will actually get vets out of doing no value-added tasks to make sure that we can actually have better availability and look at some of the issues about distribution of abattoirs across a rural area like Scotland. It's actually a very worrying situation that we're in. You know, there's lots of reasons why you want to try and keep small and rural functioning, but they've also got to comply with standards and be affordable. And at the moment, what we're witnessing is that the cost of culling animals in small areas is actually astronomical. So we're looking at solutions. We're not there yet, but we are. It's on our radar, and we are working very hard to see what solutions we can come up with to try and improve the supply and sustainability of them.
I want to move on to, and I'll come to you, Wendy, first, a question about education and skills. And I think there's an argument made that we're facing a sort of perfect storm with an ageing farming population, prohibitively high costs of entry for young and new farmers, unpredictable and increasing impacts of climate change, and then sort of really uncertain economic and political conditions and a lack of workers. Okay, so we've got this perfect storm of how do we keep doing what we want to be doing. What solutions can you offer to address these, and in particular the role of our further and higher education institutions, which I think both of us represent, but also has come up many times over the last 2 days about maybe the lack of offering that they're giving.
No, it's a really good point, and I think we're talking about higher education institutions, but I think even at the very early stages, it's important that education changes. It's really quite notable in the Scottish curriculum that we don't really have anything on agriculture and anything on food in that curriculum. I mean, in higher biology, you maybe have a tiny part, but people aren't inspired to work in the agriculture or food and drink industry. Through the Royal Society of Chemistry, we worked really hard to get food chemistry back into the curriculum because we think there's not enough people that understand the food sector. I think that needs to be done across the whole agri-food system at an early stage. But I do think that higher education has a strong role to play. I think that there's a lot that we can deliver. I think we obviously deliver the research for evidence-based policies, but I think we need to be doing a lot more, but I think it needs to come at an earlier stage so that the desire's there, and we can start to develop the educational tools that people need, because at the moment we're not doing that.
I do think we need to reconnect young people, wherever they live, to the way that food is produced and grown and experienced, whether that's chicken raising or vegetable growing or fruit crops. So I think there's a lot to be done around community gardens, community orchards, community farms. But I also think the other area that we could look at is actually trying to think about how we do covered agriculture going forward, and whether or not that needs to be set in rural settings or whether some of that can be in more urbanised settings, and to create sort of modern apprenticeships around bringing people through that, creating an interest in working in agriculture and food production, which can then take them on into other jobs elsewhere. The one thing that we are focused on at the moment is every time we're down in Westminster, we talk about the need for a population to come in, and that actually closing the doors to having people come who want to work in our food sector is not very helpful for a country that actually needs workers who want to come and work in agriculture and food production. It really has heavily hit us. You know, nearly all our vets are European, they're not UK grown vets. A lot of our meat hygiene inspectors, a lot of our environmental health officer type staff across the country do not come from the UK. So actually having a really tight migration policy is not helpful at the moment. So I think we've been working away on that, but I do think there is something about re-engaging with young people. I know my own 2 sons didn't have the pleasure that I had of spending my holidays on farms across the northeast because our farming has dropped out of our family completely. And I do feel that they lacked that. They lacked that experience. We took them to petting farms and whatever we could find, other friends' farms. But it's not the same as having that practical experience of working very closely with food production. So we have to rethink that. But I think modern apprenticeships have got a long way to go in actually just maybe not necessarily doing the formal education, but looking at some of these year 4 type projects where people can go and do learned experience in practical situations.
You're nodding a lot, William, so I'll come to you for a few points on this.
No, I love what I've heard. I don't think that higher education further have much to... They're pretty fantastic, in my opinion. But I think too many people are pushed to going to them. And I think this problem comes from the schools and the career advice, where farming isn't on the radar of the career advisors. The other thing, my daughter, who runs an architectural business, and I both agree on, she has 2 dyslexic sons. Dyslexia is not recognized in the schools as a problem until they're 8, by which time you've lost them. She had to take her sons out and educate them privately. Luckily, she could afford to. But in 1 term, her son had switched off, wasn't interested in school. A lot of people on farms are dyslexic. It's I don't know what it is, and they have spent 13 years at school being told they're crap, they're thick, they're no good, and they have switched off to learning. So by the time they leave, it's very difficult to get through to them.
Okay.
And I think the schools need to, I know it's not politically acceptable, but stream people. And if you're not going to make it to university, and why not get them into the artisan mindset and give every child a school time where they learn to enjoy learning so they can learn throughout their lives. We've got a really good apprenticeship scheme in the Northeast. In Ringlink, the machinery ring takes on a dozen or so apprentices every year, teaches them the technical skills, gets them the certificates to work safely, mentors them for the next 2 years on farm so they come out really employable farm workers. And we need more of this because because you then need lifelong learning. We've had change through our careers. Chances are there are going to be more changes for children's careers. So all we really need to teach them to do is to learn to learn. And once they can do that, they can adapt to wherever their lives take them. And
Brilliant.
after all the craft skills we're losing, and we need to capture the working with your hands mindset at 5 or 6 years old for the ones that are obviously going there and nurture them to give them a really satisfying career.
Interesting. So just on to wrap up, and I will try and eke about 2 or 3 more minutes out, because I was a little bit late. Is that okay? He's given me a thumb up. If you had a magic wand, which of course we all do in our back pockets, what lever would you pull as part of this opportunity in relation to the Good Food Nation Act and the Agriculture and Rural Community Bill? What would be your favoured lever? Wendy, I'll actually start with Wendy.
Okay, I wish there were levers that you could pull to do that, but I think it's going to come
Or
from...
what spell would you
I think it's
cast?
going to come from motivation.
Okay.
And, I think Heather's highlighted lots of reasons why we should be motivated, all those fear factors that are coming down the line. So we need stronger messaging. We need people to realise that it cannot be business as usual, that change has to come and we have to make that change. But the other thing I think is to lead by example. And I think, we should really make an effort to show people who are leading by example, and that should be rewarded. And I think that's what we should be using policy to do, to reward good leaders by example and then set the scene for other people to follow.
Heather. Go on.
Exactly. It's a great answer from Wendy. I mean, I suppose I've got a very long wish list, but at the top of it is probably that people don't let this opportunity go by us, and that we do actually not fear to talk to each other openly and honestly about what we need to affect that change. You know, sometimes we sit on the side and we moan or we grumble or whatever, but actually don't be scared to bang on a door and tell somebody this is what needs to change, because they might not have your perspective. So for me, it's about that. It's about, this is a small nation. If you've got an opinion, it should be heard. It's possible to be heard. And I think that's what we'll get the change from. It'll come from grassroots up. Policy can only enable, it can't drive that change. It has to come from the grassroots up. And that's my hope, my wish, if I had a magic lever, that the motivation would be there and everybody would just jump on the bandwagon and see what we've got to achieve in the next little while. And William?
It's a magic wand for me, and it comes from a civil servant in the European Commission, which is to write off stranded assets, which is the EU buzzword, all the stuff that we've invested in, both mental and physical, that we don't actually need going forward. The factories for what I heard described as junk, not even junk food, but junk factories, write them off, be done with them. They're not there anymore tomorrow, and we can move forward in the world we want to be in rather than the one we've been landed with.
Excellent. I think we have unfortunately run out of time, so I won't be able to ask any more questions. I hope you've enjoyed that conversation that we've had and that it is stimulating you and motivating you to bring what you have to the table and to be brave and courageous, because they're the words that are coming to my mind, about what you offer and what you bring, but also about how that works with what everybody else is bringing. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary.